Hello, I'm Microsoft MVP Tom Morgan. This is the second video in my series on building declarative agents with API plugins for Microsoft Copilot. So if you haven't already seen the first one, you might want to check that out first. It's a good introduction. In this video, we're going to look at the prerequisites you need to get started. So let's go. All right, you might have some of these already, but I'm going to start right at the beginning and go through because really, you don't need anything. These are all manifest files. You could probably get away with just Notepad, to be honest, but some of these things will just make your life a lot easier. The first one I'm going to start with is Visual Studio Code. Like I say, you may already have this. If not, it's worth getting, particularly because my next item requires it. So if you don't like using Visual Studio Code, maybe consider doing it just for this project, because the next thing you're going to need is the Teams Toolkit extension for Visual Studio Code. Now, I know that's the Teams Toolkit extension, not the Copilot extension. Bear with me for a minute. The Teams Toolkit has really evolved to become lots of different things, and it's a really, really good way of getting started building declarative agents. It's got a lot of good scaffolding in it that really helps you get started, including scaffolding for building declarative agents with and without plugins. Whilst you're there, also get the Kiota extension for Visual Studio Code. This helps the Teams Toolkit with the API plugin aspect of things. I don't think you absolutely need it, but it does make things a little bit easier and things seem just to work better with it, so it's worth getting it and putting it in. Up until quite recently, you needed to have a Copilot license to create any of these agents. Well, not necessarily to create them, but to test them. That's no longer required. There's been some changes to the licensing model, and I think you should be fine to create agents now without a license. The last thing you're going to need are some APIs. Now, we talked about the types of APIs that this would be good for in part one. What you need to do now is look at your APIs and have a kind of a good think about how you're going to use them. If you've got legacy APIs or a collection of legacy APIs already, you might want to consider creating a new API specifically for use with Copilot, even if all it does is call the other APIs behind the scenes. There are a few reasons for this. The first one is because you're only going to use a couple of calls from each API. If you make an abstraction API, it's going to end up being smaller and more simple because it's only containing those methods that you want to expose to Copilot. Because you're going to have to write an OpenAPI schema for it, it's going to make it an easier job than trying to make a schema for this ginormous API when you only actually want to use 10% of it. You could also combine several calls from different APIs together into one set of methods for one API and just expose the one API to Copilot. Copilot will happily take on multiple APIs in the manifest. It's less work for you in defining the schema if you've got a single API to work with. The other nice thing, having that abstraction API in the middle gives you really good logging and traceability because you can really be in control of what happens there. I use Azure API Management to help me do that because I find it gives really good traceability and login. It also allows you to change the input, the output sort of schemas and how the data looks on the way in and way out if you need to. This has been useful for Copilot development as Copilot is still quite new and the API plugin model is still quite new and it's changing and developing all the time. Things keep being added, and so it can be helpful having the API management layer there in order to kind of shape the data slightly to work well with how it works with Copilot. We've spoken about OpenAPI a few times. It's really important that for every API that you want to include in your Copilot declarative agent, it needs to have an OpenAPI spec file. The spec file defines the API, it describes it. It describes its methods, their parameters, and any output. It's kind of how Copilot gets to learn about your API. Copilot isn't going to go and call your API just to kind of figure out how it works. That doesn't make any sense. It needs to have a list of endpoints that it can call, and it needs to know what they do. And the OpenAPI file is that thing, is how it learns. Now, if you've already got an OpenAPI file, great. Make sure it's fully filled out. You've got really good descriptions and names for everything, because if you think about how Copilot works, it's the names and the descriptions that define how it knows like when to call a particular method. If you don't, so there's a couple of different ways you could do this. So Swagger will generate an OpenAPI file for you. Depending on how you decorate your APIs, it may or may not have good descriptions and names in it. So you might need to go into the API file and sort of do those things again afterwards. If you don't have Swagger or you don't want to use Swagger, I can really recommend using DevProxy to do this. So DevProxy is a Microsoft tool, and it's got several plugins that you can enable. One of them will create an OpenAPI file for you based on just listening to traffic. So you can say, I've got an API at localhost here. It's running on my machine. I want you to listen to traffic. So I'm going to run all my APIs. I'm going to run all the methods in them with a load of traffic and a load of data. And then I'm going to stop recording. And then DevProxy will generate an OpenAPI file for me based on the traffic it just sniffed. That's really, really powerful because it allows you to tightly scope your APIs as well. If you want to create an OpenAPI file that's only got 2 methods in it out of a 20 method API, you hit record, you just do those 2 calls, you stop. It's only going to generate the file based on what it sees. So DevProxy is a really good way of generating an OpenAPI file for you if you don't have one already and it's running on your machine, or you can invoke it and you've got full access to make those calls. Once you've got an OpenAPI file, especially if you're making changes to it, like names and descriptions and things like that, there's a really good command line tool that you can use. A Microsoft produced command line tool called HIDI. Again, I'll put links to all of these in the description, but HIDI is a nice command tool that you can use to help. Let's talk about authentication, because that's a tricky area. A lot of APIs are secured by authentication. Right now with Copilot, it will support, when you're bringing in plugins, it will support OAuth, it will support bearer tokens, it will support tokens in URL parameters, and it will support custom header fields as well, all as ways to authenticate your API call. There's different things you need to do in the OpenAPI spec to specify all of those things, and in the manifest to make sure you put the keys in the right place. There's a whole process for doing that. The keys are stored securely inside Microsoft 365. They're not put in your spec file, but your spec file needs to know that that is happening. It needs to know that these particular APIs are secured, so it can inject the key at the right time. But yeah, there's support for all of those different types of authentication method. And that's really it. There's nothing more to it than that. So if you've got all those things in place, you're ready kind of to move on to the next stage. On the next video, rather than dig straight into the code, what we're going to do is going to show a demo of something you could build just to kind of showcase the technology, so you kind of get a feel for the type of thing you could do, and then we're going to walk through how we built it. Thanks for watching.